have been rejected. That's already happening to so many people right now. I've talked to multiple colleagues just this week who have seen it firsthand. Banks are looking for any excuse to get out of high-risk lending. They're rejecting appraisals. They're asking for way more documentation. The only thing they're not asking for people is their liver. And suddenly deciding that you need 20% down, not 10. I mean, that is not normal. And that is so stressful for buyers. Now, it's not just new buyers getting hit. It's also the pre-construction project. Across the GTA, across Vancouver, across Calgary. Builders that were supposed to be fully funded by lenders are now getting dropped. Lenders who committed in 2021 are now backing out in 2025 because they know that those units are now worth far less than the original financing. So in other words, out. And you want to know how we know it's bursting? Well, CMHC just released a report showing the number of mortgage applications getting rejected. It is at a 6-year high. I'm showing a chart of that in my video. So even with demand being down, that's alarming. Fewer people are applying for mortgages, but more are getting denied. That means lenders are completely scared. They're tightening up and they're choosing safety over volume. When banks stop lending, the entire market freezes. And this is exactly what happened in 2007 and 2008 in the US. Long before anyone said the word crash, the banks just stopped lending. They pulled out of projects, they declined appraisals, they started demanding bigger deposits, and the people who were left holding the bag, I mean, just regular people, regular buyers, people who were told real estate never goes down. And now it's happening. You're not going to hear this on your main news channel. You're not going to see it on the Bank of Canada Instagram. But if you talk to people in the field,
give me 1 second, I'll find it.
Real estate agents, mortgage brokers, brokers, they will all tell you the financing is falling apart. Now, let me be really clear about one thing. This isn't just about Toronto condos or luxury properties. This is happening across all types of properties. It's happening in small towns, in second-tier cities, places like Barrie, Bowmanville, Regina.
Yeah, give it a shot.
These are places where regular families live, and the banks are saying no. Now, why are they doing this? Well, quite simply put, it's because property values have started to fall so much. And as prices come down, so do appraisals. That means that banks have to lend less. But that means more buyers need to make up the difference in cash, which, let's be honest, most of them can't. So what happens then? Well, deals fall apart, and sales go down, listings pile up, and eventually the sellers pay the price. So we're already seeing that right now. It is now July, and the number of terminated listings in the GTA is the highest level since 2017. And those weren't all just, greedy sellers trying to sell for $500,000 over asking. A lot of those were just financing failures, deals that couldn't close, or houses just sitting there on the market. And so this turns into a domino effect, and it has now started. So let's talk about the HELOCs, the home equity lines of credit. The quiet debt crisis hiding under this whole market. Canadians are carrying more HELOC debt than ever, over $170 billion nationwide. But the part that not a lot of people are talking about is banks can freeze or cancel HELOC access at any time. If your home value drops far enough, they can say, sorry, but your equity is not safe anymore. And they don't have to ask. They just do it. We saw it in 2008 in the US, and we're already seeing it now right here. Quiet HELOC freezes, especially on investment properties or cottages, are happening in BC and Ontario. And once this happens, your fallback is gone because you can't borrow more against your equity. You can't refinance, and you feel stuck. This is why banks pulling out matters so much, because they're not just leaving risky buyers behind. They're abandoning the entire middle class. The people who bought a home in 2018, 2019, or even 2020, thinking that they were doing the right thing. They were told to build equity, build wealth, ride the market. But now, that market is turning, and the banks see it firsthand. So, the banks start running. Now, let's not forget how much of this market was built on cheap money. In 2015 to 2021, borrowing was nearly free, and banks didn't care. If you had a heartbeat and a down payment, you were approved. But now, that's over, and the only thing left holding the whole market up was the assumption that lending would stay strong. But it's not. The scary part about all of this is the government can't really stop this. You can't legislate banks into lending, and you can't make them approve people. They make risk-based decisions. And right now, Canada's housing market is one giant risk. They see the delinquency rate going up. They see the over-leveraged borrowers, and they see the HELOC maxed out. So, of course, they're going to pull back on financing. Now, I want you to think about what this means for the next 6 to 12 months. If banks continue to walk away from projects, if buyers can't close because of financing, if appraisals keep coming in low, then the market sells. Prices drop, and then what? Well, if history tells us anything, it's that more sellers list. More buyers are afraid to do anything, and more panic sets in. Eventually, the big developers start to pull projects all together. I mean, it's already happening across the whole GTA. And when that happens, we're in a free fall. There are already projects in Vaughan, Saga, and even downtown Toronto, where units sold for $1,200 a square foot at launch, and now appraised at $800 to $900 a square foot or less. That is a massive drop before closing. And guess who's on the hook? It's the buyer, who now has to come up with an extra $100,000 in cash just to close. No bank is going to lend you that. And if you can't come up with that money, you lose your deposit. Or you go into forced financing. So the banks know that these people are stuck. And so that's why they're trying to get out. This is why I said the bubble has already burst. Because this is how it always starts. It's not with this big bang, like overnight, the market has officially collapsed. It is a slow, silent collapse. The people who helped fuel this market, the lenders, are quietly depriving people. And the people left holding the bag are just regular Canadians. So here's the question. If the banks are pulling out, should you? Are you still buying in this market? Are you planning to renew a mortgage this year or sell? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear what you're seeing in your area. And if you haven't watched my last video on the foreclosure wave that's already hitting Ontario and BC, please check that out next. because that was the first domino. This is the second. And then there is a third coming. Please subscribe if you're interested in real estate market news and what is happening down the street in the news. I'll keep showing you what's going on and show you the facts and data to back it all up. Thank you so much for joining me and have a wonderful day.
Accelerating Asian deflation, especially in producer prices, China and Japan, more evidence that the tariff effect on the global economy will not be inflationary. In fact, we keep getting reports all across the economy that companies are choosing to absorb the tariff. In fact, it was so much that San Francisco Fed president, a known hawk, Mary Daly, said, we're seeing the same thing. We're not seeing these tariff input cost rises flow through to consumers. Now, in China, Japan, and we should pay attention to these Asian countries because deflation there has made some very big changes. Japan is not usually deflationary in producer prices. In fact, they had a run of 8 consecutive months of positive producer prices up until May and June. Now they're accelerating somewhat to the downside, which is a huge red flag, not just because it's Japanese producer prices, but also because we're talking about May and June. This is not March. This is not April. We're now into May and June, and especially Japanese automakers, they're taking the hit as everybody sees and everybody recognizes. Over in China, Chinese producer prices are accelerating to the downside. Now, we're used to Chinese producer prices declining because, as the Chinese government has said recently, inventing a term for this called Neijuan or involution, basically they have a problem of overcapacity. And overcapacity is just a euphemism here for recession conditions, which are we've got too much productive capacity that we're using. We don't have nearly enough demand. Therefore, prices have to adjust. In fact, prices are the only way to adjust so long as that companies are told not to get rid of workers and lower their production capacity. So what all this tells us is that as far as the inflation risk from tariffs, thus far, up until the end of June, looking at Asia and its forward-looking indicators and its forward-looking conditions, we're not seeing anything like inflationary conditions. But you know who is? You know who is seeing inflation from all of this tariff business? A fellow by the name of Jamie Dimon, which means that JP Morgan must be looking to buy treasury bonds on the cheap. So Steve, we got a lot of stuff to go over here. We got Jamie Dimon, Mary Daly, the Fed. But really, I think the story here is Asian deflation. We got accelerating producer price declines in China, and I mean accelerating, especially at the factory gate level. And then even Japan is joining in saying, absorb the hits as much as we can from tariffs because we know what happens when we don't. Volume just falls off a cliff.
Yeah, Jeff, it's kind of interesting. You look to China. I mean, they've been in deflation for a very, very long time at the factory level. And, we've been talking about this air pocket that eventually there's this payback period is going to hit. And, China's just kind of been leading this for so many years, but it's now is starting to get prevalent where the government's even, like you said, making up terms for a problem of overcapacity, which is just a severe lack of global demand. And this is a real issue because they're right. And I understand why they're worried about it, because as demand goes down, what happens is companies start fighting for customers. We know there's fewer customers, and that means they're going to look to lower prices to try to gain market share. At some point, businesses just can't survive on ultra thin or no margins. And next thing you know, businesses start to close, people hit the unemployment line. And then next thing you know, your demand problem gets a whole lot worse. Now, problem with Japan I see, and this is something I'm curious about, how this is going to impact prices going forward, because we have heard from a lot of companies saying, look, we've got to absorb as much of this we can. We'll find out these tariffs are going to be even higher than we initially thought. The question is, at what point can they not absorb it? We already know what's going to happen. We know consumers are going to reject the even higher prices, but at what point can these companies just not do it and we do see an increase in the CPI, or is demand going down fast enough that we don't?
Yeah, so far that's been the case, right? The CPI in the United States and other places around the world have been relatively tame despite the price increases that have been absorbed by companies. Like you said, The one thing about China, though, is that companies are told you can't adjust your production capacity. We need you to continue to basically run a jobs program because demand is so lackluster and really weak. So that's China's stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Because when you have a lack of demand, there's really only two things you can do. You can either cut your prices and try to sell goods cheaper because there isn't enough buyers, or you can cut back on production, which the Chinese government says, don't you do that because we need to have our factories filled and running because we do not tolerate unemployment here. So the Chinese government has actually, this new term we're talking about, Neijuan, involution, it was invented and publicized a couple months ago, all the way up at the top levels of the Chinese government. In fact, it was the Chinese premier, number 2, Li Kang, who put it in a report in March, said, we are going to do something about the overcapacity in China, which, I mean, you have to chuckle about that because, again, overcapacity just means there aren't enough customers to keep these factories running in the way that they need to maintain levels of employment. So what's noteworthy about all that is they had overcapacity fears heading into May and June, and then suddenly producer prices accelerate to the downside. And now the Chinese government is announcing all these concrete plans to eliminate overcapacity, which means there's maybe a major shift in China in terms of government approach where they're not just going to tolerate lower prices. They may actually have to tolerate rising unemployment, thinking that maybe rising unemployment is the least of the two evils here, which is, I mean, that to me suggests that this is a substantial shift in the Chinese economy as it relates to the overall global economy. Again, the problem here isn't capacity. It's not oversupply. It's lack of demand. So as Steve just said, is the Chinese shift in their political situation and their political directives, is that an indication the Chinese see it too, that demand has gotten to be too big? They can't just sit here and tolerate more prices going down lower and lower and lower.
Yeah, Jeff, so what do you do in this case? Do you pump out a lot of stimulus? Do you just say, go to factory and say, look, we're going to buy production here and just fill full of warehouses and try to dump it on the global market, which is exactly what we're seeing in the tariffs we're trying to stop. But a lot of other countries are saying, look, we've got too much of your stuff too. And so at some point, again, like you said, there isn't enough demand. It's not just China's capacity that we're talking about. It's global capacity. And I don't think a lot of people realize that it's not just payback from the pandemic. It's not just payback from front-running tariffs. There's also a demographic factor. We saw a lot of baby boomers during the pandemic retire. Well, Jeff, as you know, when people go into retirement, their spending naturally goes down. I mean, they're not commuting to work. They're not buying as many cars. They're not buying the dress clothes. We can go on and on about all the things they're not buying because they're starting to watch their income. There's no overtime, no bonuses, none of that stuff. So there's a number of factors here that is a real big problem for the global economy. The question I'm wondering now is, what term is the Fed going to make up?
That's a good question because they want to make up a question. They want to make up a term. The Chinese are really good about that. That's what the Communist Party does well. Among the few things that it does do well, they come up with